Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. Today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 25, and this is an important transition point in the journey we've been taking through the story of the book of Genesis. We started with the creation of the universe, how God spoke it into existence. We saw the creation of humanity as we were intended to be the image bearers and the image and likeness of God, to represent His character, His attributes to the created universe. We saw how humanity fell, and we've been following humanity's journey as God interacts with them. And then we focus specifically on this man, Abram, and his wife, Sarai, and how God called them out, called them from all they knew to something that only He could show them. We saw the promise that He gave them. And then we watched decades go by as they waited on God to fulfill the beginning of the promise that was in opposition to physical reality. And now we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 25, where we come to the death of Abraham. We are reaching the end of an important part of the story and the beginning of the next part, seeing how God will continue His promise into the next generation. So let's enter into the text in Genesis chapter 25. Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Leshurim, and Luermim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Henoch, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. So we have an account of the last part of the life of Abraham here. And in this account, we see the common practice of his day, but we also see a focus on the promise. So we're told that after the death of Sarah, at some point after her death, that Abraham took another wife, and through that wife he had children. He also had concubines, which would be women who held position in the household. One has referred to them as secondary wives. So their children received some of the blessing that would come of being part of the household, though they did not have the same status as a wife would have. And Abraham had children, he had descendants. And we're told that as the death of Abraham is approaching, he sent all of these other children away. He blessed them, he gave them gifts. If we recall, Abraham was a very wealthy man. So he made sure all his descendants, all of the children who came through these women were all well looked after. But as far as his name, as far as the bulk of his wealth, as far as the land that he owns now in Canaan, as far as all of that, and with that, a sense of the promise, all of that Abraham gave to Isaac. This is important because this refers back to the promise. The Lord told Abraham that he would give him a son. A son would come to Abraham through his wife Sarah. And through Isaac, the son, God would fulfill the promise that he made. He made Abraham a promise at the very beginning when he called him out of Haran, and he said, I am going to make you a great nation. I will bless you and make you a blessing. And everyone who blesses you, I will bless, and everyone who dishonors you, I will curse. And through this line, through your descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. But the first step in the promise was Isaac. So Abraham is in fact recognizing the promise in giving all to Isaac. This is a recognition of the promise that God has made. This is important for us to recognize because this shows us at the end of Abraham's life his dependence on the promise of God, his dependence on the character of God. So since God said it's going to come through Isaac, Abraham is not going to mess that up. He's not going to try to work it out himself. He's not going to say, well, yes, Isaac, but I have now these other children, so I'm also going to include them in this community. So just in case something should happen with Isaac's line, I've got these other lines. He has reached the point now where he is putting all his trust in the promise. Which in effect, to trust the promise of God is to trust God. Abraham has learned to trust God. Let's continue. Verse 7, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. If you recall, when we go back to the earlier chapters, in one of the first conversations that God has with Abraham, when he gives him the vision of what will happen to his descendants, when he tells them that a day is coming when your descendants will leave the land and will go into Egypt, and there in Egypt they will remain for over 400 years, and they will become servants and slaves in Egypt, and that a day will come when God will go and will call them out of Egypt and will redeem them with a mighty hand and give them back the land that he had promised to Abraham. But as God is laying out this promise, he also tells Abraham, but this is in the future, you will live a long life and you will die at a good old age. And we see that God again has been faithful to the promise. Abraham's lifespan itself, the blessings he's experienced itself, is tied to the promise of God made to Abraham. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave at Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lalaloi. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Mibshem, Mishma, Durma, and Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. So we have this picture here of Ishmael. And it's important to notice this as well. Because again, this is tied to promise. Even though Ishmael was not intended to be the child of promise to fulfill the promise God had made to Abraham, God did say to Hagar at the very beginning, when she was pregnant with Ishmael, when she was going to have a son, and she began to think of herself more highly, and Sarah turned against her, and Sarah made her life difficult, and she fled away, ran off into the wilderness, not knowing where she was going to. And the angel of the Lord, most likely a Christophany, the Lord himself, called to her and asked her, "From where are you coming and where are you going?" And she said that she was fleeing from her mistress, Sarai. And we have this picture here, this beautiful picture, where God says that he has heard and gives her a promise. And then later on, this promise is brought up again. This promise, he said, "I will bless him. I will bless Ishmael, and 12 princes will come from him, and they will also grow to be nations." See, the Lord keeps his promises. So we have in here, in case someone is reading and thinking, okay, I see that the Lord was faithful to Abraham. He kept his promise, died at a good old age, had the son of promise. The Lord blessed him in his ways. Now we have Isaac, and we have the promise continuing through him. But what about Ishmael? And we're reminded here in the genealogy that the promise to Ishmael was fulfilled as well, because the Lord keeps all his promises. The Lord is not slack. The Lord keeps all his promises. All of them. So let's continue. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived, the children struggling together within her. And she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." So we have this picture here, the next part of the story. We're now back to Isaac. So we're going to hear how God is fulfilling the promise with Isaac. So we're given that picture again, of course, that Abraham had Isaac. Abraham and Sarah. And then, of course, we have Isaac and Rebekah. But again, we have this common theme. Did you see the similarity here? Just as Abraham and Sarah were given the promise, yet had the promise in the face of what seemed like the physical reality that was impossible. Sarah was unable to have children. So we have Abraham and Sarah, and only the Lord is going to be able to provide to keep the promise. So the Lord provides. And Isaac is born. Isaac takes Rebekah as his wife, and if you recall from that earlier chapter how the Lord directed the servant, how the Lord answered his prayer, the Lord went before him, that Rebekah was intended to be the wife of Isaac, but now she is unable to have children. So again, he now inherits the promise, she inherits the promise, but again, the physical reality appears to be against them. So what does Isaac do? Isaac calls out to the Lord. One of the things that Isaac has learned, probably from the testimony of his father and mother, that in the face of the physical reality, one stands on the promise. So he calls out to the Lord, and the Lord answered his prayer. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And she conceives, and she has twins. Of course, back in the days before ultrasounds and everything else, all she knows is that she is carrying, she has a baby within her, but suddenly there's all this discomfort and she's not sure what it is. So she calls on the name of the Lord, and the Lord responds to her and tells her this powerful statement. It says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. What a picture. We're seeing the next part of God's plan, the next part of the promise being worked out. But we see it, and there's a new element here, because we have these twins. And now God has given another prophecy, another part of the promise. And he says, these twins will be 2 nations. Remember how God first told Abram, you will be a mighty nation, and then God began to expand the promise and said, from you will come nations, a number of nations. Well, we see this part of the promise being fulfilled, because we're told that Rebekah will give birth to twins, to 2, and each of them in their offspring, in their descendants, will produce a separate nation. So it's the next part of fulfilling the promise. We're also told some interesting things here. We're told that one will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And this seems strange, because in ancient Near Eastern culture, and has continued even up into the modern day in many cultures, that the eldest, the firstborn, held privileged position in the household. The firstborn inherited the rights and the blessings and the names and the majority of the property. The firstborn took the title. And yet we're told here that though one will be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. This is prophecy. This is foreshadowing of what is to come. Then we see, in verse 24, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. So the first comes out and they call him Esau, which sounds like the Hebrew word for red. So he's literally named for his physical appearance when he's born. He's got a lot of hair that's visible on his body, and his skin is quite red, and so they basically called him that. Today, I guess we'd nickname him Red, but he's Esau. He is delivered first. So even though they're a set of twins, because he's delivered first, he is the firstborn. Which means in the order of the household, he is now the privileged one in Isaac's household. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. And the interesting thing with Jacob, so you have this physical image. The first twin is coming out as the second twin is coming out behind him. The second twin appears to be gripping the heel of his twin brother, of his now older brother. So looking at this, they name them according to what they first see. So Esau is named Red. Jacob is named one who grips by the heel, which in sort of general language in Hebrew would refer to one who trips you up. Or someone would say he'd be called the cheater, the trickster, the deceiver. One who trips you up. The idea one who comes behind and grabs you by the leg and trips you. In that image they saw visibly. But of course the names also, there is prophetic meaning in the names, particularly for Jacob. To be one who tricks, who supplants the other. As we see the story unfold, as God is working out his promise in very real people. And that's another thing that we see as we continue on this journey. As before, we see that these are real people interacting with a real God in real history. So as real people, real fallen people, real broken people, we're going to see how they live out their lives in the midst of a promise that God has made. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Take a moment and notice that. Isaac, when he got married, when he began his life with Rebekah, Isaac was 40. Well, it would have been very soon after getting married, they discovered that she was not able to conceive children. So notice, we were told earlier that when she was unable to have children, he called on to the Lord, and the Lord heard him and answered him. But notice this. He was 60 years old when the boys were born. It's important for us to notice this too in Scripture, because sometimes we have the danger in following the promise that we compress time. And I want you to notice this because God works on his timetable. God's timing is perfect. But oftentimes, as we follow the journey of people in the Old Testament, we discover that there are great periods of waiting on the Lord. As the Lord is working and testing and refining us in our relationship with him, there are long periods of waiting. So for Abraham was called out of Haran and received the promise when he was 75. He did not receive Isaac his son until he was 100. 25 years from hearing the promise to seeing it actualized. Now we have Isaac. Isaac grows up hearing about the promise for his life and his generation and his descendants. God supplies him with his partner, with his wife, and yet at 40 he enters into a marital relationship with Rebekah. But 20 years go by before he sees the next part of the promise actualized. God takes his time to do the work he desires to do in and through each of us. And we need to be conscious of this, conscious of time. Don't accidentally compress events, because it is often in the waiting that the Lord is doing much of his work in his people. There is much happening in the waiting, some of which he reveals and some of which he does not. And that waiting is important, to wait on the Lord. Isaac called on the name of the Lord. Likely he called on the name of the Lord many times in 20 years. And after 20 years, the Lord reveals his hand and fulfills the next part of the promise. Waiting on the Lord. Verse 27. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now we see something here that goes back, of course, to the prophetic statement that the Lord gave to Rebekah. Said that one shall be stronger than the other. And we see, as far as in human appearance and human activity, Esau is the man's man. We are told he's a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Those things that would be prized even in modern culture, particularly in ancient culture, he's able to provide. He's able to take things on. He's able to deal with danger. He's developed skill. And then we have Jacob, and we're told Jacob is a quiet man dwelling in tents. He is doing the kind of work that would be done around the household, not out. So we can see which is likely the stronger and which is the weaker. But we also remember the last part of the promise. The last part of that prophecy, we are told that the older shall serve the younger. And we know Esau is the older brother. By virtue of being born first, he is the older brother. And the Lord has already told them, whether they remember it, Esau will eventually serve Jacob. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This is important as we continue with the story, but again, it's also a picture of the real human beings involved in the story. Because we look at this, and part of us looks at this and goes, but it shouldn't be that way. What do you mean that Isaac loved his firstborn and Rebekah loved Jacob? Shouldn't they love them both equally? Yes, they should. But this is a real story, dealing with real people, with their biases, their weaknesses, their strengths, and how God is going to be at work in the midst of them. In the midst of their frailty, God is going to be at work. So as you reflect on this chapter, I would encourage you to think about how the Lord continues to be faithful to his promise. He was faithful to Abraham. He was faithful to Isaac. He was faithful to Ishmael. He is faithful to Isaac and Rebekah. He is going to work out his promise, though sometimes the waiting on the fulfillment of the promise may be a long wait. But he will honor his promises, just as he will honor every promise made in his word to each of us. If we know Christ, he has made promises to us, and he will honor them in Christ, in his timing, for his glory, in his way. I hope this is an encouragement to you. As always, we'd love to hear your comments and your feedback, and if this has blessed you or encouraged you, please share it with somebody else. Thank you, and God bless you.